Diane drove a 12-year-old sedan with a small dent in the rear bumper she'd never bothered fixing, wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation through most winters, and lived in a house her neighbors assumed was rented rather than owned outright. When she passed away, her actual net worth surprised almost everyone who thought they knew her. Several $1 million, quietly accumulated over 4 decades, none of it visible in how she lived. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't deprivation either. It was a strategy, and understanding why it worked matters more than most people realize. My name is Emory, and if you've ever assumed that visible signs of wealth, a new car, a renovated kitchen, a certain kind of watch, were reliable evidence of someone's actual financial position, then this video should help explain why that assumption is usually backwards. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep breaking down the parts of personal finance that run counter to how things appear on the surface. Most people think looking wealthy is a sign of financial success. They're completely wrong, and the reason matters because in the majority of cases, visible spending and actual net worth move in opposite directions rather than the same one. A pattern documented extensively in research on how self-made wealth actually accumulates versus how it's commonly assumed to look. To understand why, it helps to separate 2 things that get constantly conflated: income and wealth. Income is what arrives each month. Wealth is what's left after everything spent gets subtracted from everything earned, compounding quietly in the background. Someone earning $200,000 a year who spends $190,000 of it has meaningfully less wealth accumulation than someone earning $80,000 who spends $50,000, even though the first person appears far more successful by every visible signal available. The visible signals, the car, the house, the vacations, are almost entirely a function of spending, not income. And spending is the exact variable working against wealth accumulation rather than for it. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting. Research into self-made millionaires consistently finds that a large share of them live in middle-class neighborhoods, drive ordinary vehicles well past the point most people would trade them in, and spend meaningfully less than their income would technically allow. This isn't a coincidence or a personality quirk shared by a specific type of person. It's a direct mechanical consequence of how compound growth actually works. Every dollar not spent on a depreciating signal of wealth is a dollar available to be invested. And every dollar invested rather than spent starts compounding immediately, which means the gap between someone who looks wealthy and someone who quietly is wealthy tends to widen every single year rather than staying constant. Someone might reasonably ask why this matters if someone can genuinely afford the visible signals, since spending money one has actually earned isn't inherently irrational. It's a fair question, and the honest answer lies in what economists call opportunity cost, not whether a purchase is affordable in the moment, but what that same money would have become if invested instead. A $70,000 car, purchased instead of a $25,000 reliable one, represents a $45,000 difference that, invested in a broad market index fund earning a typical long-term return, would grow to roughly $176,000 over 20 years. The car itself will be worth close to nothing by then. The foregone investment, however, keeps compounding regardless of what happens to the vehicle. This connects directly to a phenomenon worth naming precisely: lifestyle inflation, the tendency for spending to rise in near-perfect proportion to income as it grows. Someone who receives a 20% raise and correspondingly upgrades their car, their housing, and their general spending by roughly that same amount hasn't actually improved their financial trajectory at all, despite feeling like they have. Their income went up, but so did the amount required to sustain their new visible lifestyle, meaning the gap between income and spending, the only part that actually builds wealth, stayed exactly the same or in many cases shrank. This is precisely why income alone is such a poor predictor of long-term wealth, and why some of the highest earners accumulate surprisingly little. while some moderate earners accumulate substantially more. Someone might reasonably ask whether this means
Hmm.
all visible spending is a mistake. Since taken to an extreme, this logic could argue against ever enjoying money at all. It's a fair concern, and the honest answer is no. This isn't an argument for deprivation. It's an argument for deliberate choice over automatic escalation. The distinction that matters is between spending that's consciously chosen, because it genuinely adds value to someone's life, and spending that happens simply because income allows it or because visible signals feel expected in a particular social context. Someone who deliberately chooses to spend meaningfully on something they genuinely value, travel, a hobby, a specific experience, while remaining deliberately modest in areas that don't matter as much to them, isn't practicing deprivation. They are practicing allocation, which is a fundamentally different thing than simply spending less across the board. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting a second time, because there's a social mechanism at work here that deserves to be named directly rather than left implicit. Visible spending often functions less as a personal preference and more as a signal directed outward, toward neighbors, co-workers, and social circles, a way of communicating status rather than a purchase made purely for personal utility. This dynamic has been studied extensively under the framework of conspicuous consumption, the observation that a meaningful portion of high-visibility spending exists specifically to be seen by others, not simply to be enjoyed privately. Once spending is understood partly as social signaling rather than purely personal consumption, the strategic value of opting out of that signal becomes much clearer, because the entire mechanism depends on comparison, and someone who stops participating in that comparison removes an enormous, ongoing source of financial pressure that never actually delivers lasting satisfaction in return. Someone might reasonably ask whether opting out of visible spending carries its own social cost, since status and image do have real consequences in careers, relationships, and social standing. It's a fair concern, and the honest answer is that this cost is genuinely context-dependent rather than universal. In certain professional contexts, particularly ones built around client-facing sales or specific industries where visible success functions as a credibility signal, some level of visible spending may serve a legitimate professional purpose worth weighing directly. But for the large majority of people, in the large majority of contexts, the actual social cost of driving a modest car or living in an ordinary home is far smaller than most people assume, largely because most people are too focused on their own financial pressures to scrutinize someone else's as closely as it might feel like they are. By the time this pattern compounds across several decades, the numbers involved become substantial. Someone who consistently redirects even a modest gap between what they could spend and what they actually spend, say $500 a month, into a simple investment strategy, accumulates roughly $260,000 over 20 years, or well over $600,000 over 30 years, at typical long-term market returns. None of this required an unusually high income, a lucky break, or an aggressive investment strategy. It required a consistent gap between appearance and reality, maintained deliberately over a long period of time. So if the actual question is why looking poor matters so much, the honest answer isn't about deprivation or hiding success out of modesty for its own sake. It's about recognizing that visible wealth and actual wealth are frequently working against each other, and that every dollar spent maintaining an appearance is a dollar removed from the compounding process that builds the real thing. The math doesn't reward looking successful, and it doesn't punish someone for genuinely enjoying their money either. It simply rewards the gap between what's earned and what's spent, regardless of whether anyone else ever notices that gap exists at all.